Hi, this is Phenomenology, and my name is Mark Thorsby. In this video, we'll be taking a look at Edmund Husserl's text, Ideas Pertaining to a Pure Phenomenology and to a Phenomenological Philosophy, first book, also known as Ideas 1. In this video in particular, we're going to be taking a look at Part 3, Chapter 2 of that text. Here's the text, by the way. Great book, difficult book. And this chapter is entitled Universal Structures of Pure Consciousness. So welcome back, everyone. Let's just jump right into it. We're going to see today that Husserl, in our last video, looked at some of the concerns or problems that might be indicative of phenomenology in terms of its methodology. Today we're going to see as Husserl, instead of making methodological remarks, is going to be trying to isolate and articulate what some of the most high-level structures for consciousness are. Okay, so let's sort of jump into it. We're going to start off here with section 76, the theme of the following investigation. So basically in this section, Husserl just introduces the basic goal of the chapter. As we've said before, phenomenology is the investigation of consciousness. Here's a sort of model here, which is important that he reminds us of in this chapter, is at the core of consciousness is what we would call absolute consciousness. And this is ultimately what phenomenology is studying, right? And then around that core, if you will, is what we might call psychological constitution. Psychological consciousness, pardon me. Of course, Husserl, for phenomenology, we're interested in absolute consciousness, but it's important to keep in mind the difference here, and that there is a relationship between absolute consciousness and psychological consciousness, but though there is an important divide. And of course, if you will, the way in which we maintain a discussion of absolute consciousness is through the phenomenological epoch and through a variety of phenomenological reductions. If you need a reminder on those, take a look at some of the earlier videos in the series in which Husserl, in which I or we go over Husserl's sort of fundamental concepts about phenomenological reduction. Now, one of the things here that's number two is that the relationship between pure consciousness and psychological consciousness is not altogether clear. He does articulate the idea that we're concerned with absolute consciousness, and that in this reduction gives us ability to take a look at what we might call the transcendental manifold of consciousness, but it's not exactly clear where the relationship begins and ends, and that's going to be pretty important for Husserl's overall project. So part of this chapter is meant to help us understand the difference between these two forms of consciousness. And we're going to do that by isolating these universal structures of absolute consciousness, which are not indicative but are necessary conditions for psychological consciousness. Number three, one of the goals for this chapter is to identify what some of the major themes within the field of phenomenology. What are those themes? And we're going to see, really, he's going to talk about intentionality in this section. He'll also introduce ever so quickly the conception of the noesis. And we're going to talk about that more in the next video, but that's one of the core themes in phenomenology that he's going to break down in his discussion of intentionality. And number four, and I just sort of pulled this right from the text itself, there's this reference to one of the things we will need to look at are what the fundamental lines of description are that are prescribed by the most universal, essential species of mental processes. And so this is what we're going to be doing in phenomenology, is after we do this reduction, Husserl is going to take a look at what some of the aspects of consciousness are, the species, and these are going to be universal and essential to all of phenomenology, consciousness really, and therefore to phenomenology. So that's in general what the general topic and theme for this chapter is. Okay, in section 77, Husserl begins his discussion of reflection. Of course, reflection is really important because that's what the philosophers are doing, but not just philosophers, right? But importantly for us, phenomenology occurs as a movement or an activity of reflection. So we're going to see that reflection is fundamental here, and there's a fundamental peculiarity of the sphere of mental processes. And so he's going to sort of begin to talk about reflection, and we'll see that in the first couple sections of this chapter are really aimed at a clarification of what it means to engage in reflection. And so let's just sort of think about it for a moment before we I go through all these key points to consider. Think about the idea that think of a case in which one reflects, right? So imagine I'm living my life, and then I go to open my car door, for instance, and I reach down in my pocket, my keys are not there. And then I stop and I say, well, where did I put my keys? And I begin a process of reflection. Of course, this is not the type of reflection we're doing in phenomenology. It's much more, I guess, delimited by the scope of the investigation. But you could see here that reflection raises some very interesting questions about consciousness. Because while I'm conscious of the car in an immediate sense, it's in my intentional line of sight, if you will. Reflection is a movement of consciousness as well, but it's also unbounded. Also keep in mind that in phenomenology, in our last video, we talked a lot about free fantasy and the role that free fantasy, or feelings as Husserl refers to them, gently speaking, um, these are also activities of reflection, right? So since the phenomenological method operates in, through, and by reflection, we really need to first just understand what the role of reflection itself is. So what are some of the key points to consider from Husserl's vantage point? The first here is that each ego is living its mental processes, right? So this is really fundamental. It's not that I, as an ego, have reflection, right? It's rather that I'm living through reflection. And that difference is actually quite important and quite fundamental, because that means that reflection for me is not and cannot be an object of perception in the same manner that, for instance, the object of the car can exist to me in its phenomenal appearing, right? So each ego is living its mental processes. Point number two, one doesn't have the mental process as an object in immanent consciousness, right? So the mental process itself, that phenomenology is trying to uncover, and here the mental process is that of reflection. This isn't an object in our immanent field of consciousness. Number three, reflection, you might say then, is an object for analysis, but it's an object that's for the ego, not of the ego or about the ego, but for the ego. And this sort of designator for, you can see I've put it in bold here, right, is meant to emphasize the degree and the means by which reflection is a living process, right? The other 2 points I'll sort of mention here that are going to be important for us is to remember the difference between reflection and recollection. Reflection is the process whereby one, I suppose, and I'm not using Husserl's lingo here, but reflection is this process whereby I'm thinking about something, right? I'm reflecting about it. Whereas recollection is when I can recall a previous thinking into consciousness, right? So this difference is important. Oftentimes we have recollection and reflection are sort of fused together in a single movement, but they are analytically distinct. The second here is a difference of terms that we're going to see him talk about quite a bit here in the next couple sections, and that's the difference between retention and protension, right? So retention refers to this idea that when I'm in the process of reflection, right, what I have just reflected upon, but I'm not reflecting on at that moment, I can still recall because it's in a moment of retention. I can retain it. Um, Conversely, protension refers to the means by which I can anticipate a future movement of consciousness or a future movement in reflection. So this distinction between retention and protension, we're going to see is pretty important when we talk about time consciousness. And Husserl in this video, or in this chapter, will begin to talk about time consciousness and what it means, what it means for us to be thinking, or what consciousness is in terms of its temporal sequencing, or in terms of its temporal nature. And it's not the same thing as our ordinary space-time continuum, if you will. There seems to be a difference here, and we'll get into that in a moment. But we're going to see that retention and protension play really important roles for Husserl's overall schematization of time consciousness, right? So let's start. He gives this example, which is a sort of odd example, but it's fine. We'll go with it. And he says, imagine, for instance, there's a celebration at theoretical insight, right? So imagine, for instance, you're reading this book and you're struggling through it, and then all of a sudden you have that aha moment, the light bulb goes off, right? And you suddenly realize what Husserl is talking about, and you realize the far extent and really maybe the power, the wonder, the beauty, etc., of phenomenological philosophy. So let's imagine you get a theoretical insight and then you're celebrating it, right? All of that is occurring in consciousness, right? So one of the things we can say is that there's a certain rejoicing in this case, right? But the rejoicing is something that's continuous, that's in continuance, right? So that's the first sort of feature to think about here. Also is that we can reflect on reflection, right? So when I have this theoretical insight and I'm celebrating it, I'm reflecting on my reflection, right? Second thing here is that there's a recollection. Even though there's both a recollection, there's also an expectation. And there, Husserl is really emphasizing and giving us, what would we call it? A foreshadowing of this term protension, which I just talked about earlier. He doesn't mention the term protension in this section, but he does talk about retention. So think of it in terms of expectation. And then finally, in this moment, if we affect the phenomenological reduction, we begin to see that there are essential structures to reflection itself, right? So imagine that you finally get the book and you're excited and you're happy. Now let's enact the phenomenological reduction. And let's assume that your celebration, all of this, that there has no actuality to it. It doesn't refer to anything that's really existing. And in that sense, we've just conflated or reduced down this experience into a mere set of appearances. And now our sort of question is, okay, what does it mean? What does it mean to have a reflection on reflection here? If we're just talking about mere appearances in mere phenomenal appearances. And so you could see here that there has to be an essential eidetic structure. And Husserl in this chapter, of course, is going to try to outline parts of that, though it is not exhaustive. In section 78, he begins his phenomenological study of reflections on mental processes, right? So here we get sort of a quick definition of reflection, where Husserl designates reflection by saying that reflection refers to, quote, acts in which the stream of mental processes become evidentially apprehensible and analyzable, right? So this is sort of important. Reflection is something, it's an activity, and it occurs within the stream of mental process, but this activity consists fundamentally in bringing something through evidence into a movement of apprehension, and also bringing it into the foreground in which it can be analyzed, right? Which makes total sense. But that means what? It means that reflection is a modification of consciousness, right? So that means that when we do engage in reflection, it's not just that reflection is something that happens in consciousness, right? Because remember, reflection is a lived process. Rather, reflection is the modification of consciousness itself. So there's a very special place for reflection then. Now, it's a modification, ultimately, because it signifies a change in our attitude regarding the immanental object, right? So for instance, right now when I'm here, here's a water bottle, like a bicycle water bottle. In these videos, you notice I always have a different water bottle. I don't know why, but I have this water bottle, right? And it's immanently given to me in consciousness. Even when I enact the phenomenological reduction, it's still the case that this appearing is in my here and now field of perception. And this appearing is something that is not voluntary, as it were, right? But you can think, what happens when I start to reflect upon the water bottle, right? I just gave the example, I'm always having water bottles in my videos, but they're different kinds. That itself is a movement of reflection about the immanental object. And you can see here that reflection, therefore, is a modification insofar as it changes what he's previously referred to as our attitudes. Now, any mental process can be converted into a reflectional modification. This is actually really, really important if it's true. Why is it so important? Because it's only because any of our mental processes can be converted by this reflective modification that phenomenology is actually possible. Because if it was the case that mental processes could not be reflected upon through this conscious modification, then that means that there would be, if you will, areas and arrays of manifold forms of consciousness that phenomenology couldn't reflect upon, and that would mean, therefore, that phenomenology would operate blindly. So this is a sort of important feature, but it also seems to be evidently true, right? So regardless of why it's important or how it's important, you can see that it seems to be the case where I can take any mental process and convert it into sort of reflective movement. Even, for instance, to something as, which seems like, for instance, think about a joke someone tells you. If someone tells you a joke and you laugh, right, that's one thing. But in the process of laughing at a joke doesn't seem like something you would really think about, but you can convert that into reflection and try to figure out what made the joke funny or whatever. So any of these mental processes can be converted. And actually important, any mental process in consciousness. So we're not talking about the mental processes, for instance, you might call the neurological processes that operate my motor functions, for instance, mental processes, but we're not talking about those because those are not processes of consciousness per se, like, or my heart beating, right? That's a mental process, perhaps. But that's not the kind of mental process we're talking about. Now, here is what I've done is I've sort of listed off a number of ideas, and I'll sort of go through them here. A number of key points from Husserl's perspective. First here is that all of the modes of seizing upon, remember he's used this language previously, all of these modes of seizing upon the essences of things, all of this falls under reflection. So you can see here why he's beginning his discussion of the universal structures of consciousness with reflection, because all of what we're doing in phenomenology falls under this, right? Now, every mental process is in a flux of becoming, right? And this is important because the mental processes of consciousness are not on off, right? It's not like they're separated. It's a total stream, and all of it is coming. And you can see once we begin to talk about a flux of becoming, we're talking about time, right? And we're talking about the question of what does it mean for these conscious processes of reflection to occur insofar as they're temporally organized, right? So this sort of question of the relationship between time and consciousness he's sort of beginning to sort of poke his head up and say, think about this here. Number three is that every mental process has its parallel in different forms of reproductions, right? And here's a sort of important thing is that when we reflect upon and we modify consciousness and we reflect on something, it looks like we're reproducing an idea or a mental process in a sort of parallel fashion. Now, there's a common essential composition for these parallel mental processes. There has to be one way in which they essentially get composed together. Now, but what do I mean by parallel? Well, these things are parallel in that they should point to the same intentional objectives or objects, right? So, for instance, you can think when we have the experience of the water bottle in the immanent, right, we have an objectivity, right, that we can intentionally direct consciousness towards. Now, but think about when you recall, recollect, and then reflect upon the experience you just had of the water bottle I showed you, right? You can see here is that that's a parallel mental process because it's referring to the same thing, right? You're still thinking about the same object, even though now you're actually putting into consciousness what you remembered seeing of the water bottle, right? But it's parallel in that sense. So he defines parallel here. Now, he does talk about an absolute originary phase, and the absolute originary phase of consciousness is the living now, right? So that's what's happening in this process when we're living. Now, that which is reflected upon recollection is ultimately a reduction, right? So now think about the water bottle I showed you, and you're thinking of a concept of memory in this case, but you have reduced it down, right? It's not as clear to you what all of the features of the water bottle, and you're also, essentially reducing down what you could see, right? And now you can see it has these different figures on it and that sort of thing. You can see there's details that get reduced out in the recollection. But The recollection is still okay because it stands in the same relation to the intentional objectivity and to the intentional object. Now, what makes something legitimate? Here Husserl says that the absolute legitimacy of retention, right, recalling something, is of something immanent, right? There's an absolute legitimacy of the retentional, right? For example, we can always remember what we've experienced was a tone and not a color, right? So there is something legitimate about what we can retain. Now, here you can also think about there's also a way in which there is a failure of legitimacy under certain conditions. We're not going to get into that, but there is a legitimacy of recollection. Now, if there wasn't a legitimacy, then that would mean that when in reflection, when we recall what we've experienced in consciousness, we would never be sure that we're recalling the right thing. And if that was the case, then you see reflection would break down, right? So there has to be something legitimate here. And it has to be, otherwise reflection breaks down, phenomenology breaks down, all science breaks down, etc., etc. Everything goes wrong. But there is also a relative legitimacy of reflection here, too. So there's an absolute legitimacy, a way of looking at our retention in an absolute legitimate sense, and also a relatively legitimate sense. He, quote, "It would be countersensical to mean that mental processes would be cognitionally assured only to the extent that they're given in reflectional consciousness pertaining to the perceiving of something immanent," right? So that's in 151, and then again later he says, "It would also be wrong to doubt that having existed of what is found is still intended," and he refers to this as immediate. I think that's, yeah, immediate retention. Okay, so that's a couple key points from that chapter I wanted to throw your way, just as we're starting to think about this. Now, in section 79, Husserl begins really a long series of critical remarks. He calls it a critical excursus regarding phenomenology and the difficulties of self-observation. In this video, I'm not going to go through all of the details of what he talks about because it's actually quite long, and quite frankly, it's slightly off topic regarding to what Husserl is doing, hence it's a sort of excursion for him. And part of the reason he's writing this is because he's actually he's responding to particular problems that are raised by T. Watts. I believe it's Theodore Watts. And some of the problems. And so he sort of takes a quick aside here in terms of its relationship. Why? Well, because when we talk about phenomenology, we're talking about observing ourselves. And so this raises a question: is phenomenology really just a type of self-observation? And if so, then how does phenomenology gain knowledge when the process is a lived process and it doesn't and such that it does not result in the object of knowledge, right? So you have this sort of question here: if our consciousness is a lived process, and phenomenologists are making these reductions, these phenomenological epoches, if you will, then what does it exactly mean? What kind of knowledge can be gained from phenomenology? Now, of course, all of this is happening in reflection. And this raises a genuine problem of skepticism that Husserl needs to address. And he actually defines in here what skepticism means in its genuine formulation. He writes that genuine skepticism results when an argument implicitly presupposes as conditions of its very possibility that which it explicitly denies in its theses, right? So skepticism essentially occurs when an argument presupposes what we have to deny, right? So you end up in a sort of contradiction, and because you're in that contradiction, of course, you'd have to deny that you know anything because knowledge has to be at least logical, and this would not be logical. And so the question here is, does phenomenology do this? That is, does phenomenology presuppose as a condition that which it explicitly denies? And so this is sort of raises some questions. And you can see Husserl in our previous video did discuss a little bit about this when he did talk about the idea of whether or not the self gets excluded in the phenomenological reduction, given that the phenomenological reduction can only be enacted by a self, right? And so he sort of subverted that, but he's returning to it to some degree here. You can tell that there's a deeper worry here, I think, that Husserl is concerned with, that quite frankly, I'm not convinced that he deals with it in a fully fleshed out manner. That's probably not fair on my part. But it seems to me it's a recurring worry, which if it's a recurring worry, then we haven't really put it to bed. Now, phenomenology, he does say in this section, I just throw this in here, he says it ultimately is going to be the court of appeal for methodologically based questions of psychology, right? And you can see here that this question of self-observation, he's understanding from this Watts perspective to be a question given out of a sort of psychological frame of reference, which we won't go into naturalism psychology. You can look at the earliest videos we've been talking about to take a look at what his retort regarding that would be. The cognition of possibilities will precede the cognition of actuality. And this, for me, was probably the most important thing he talks about in the chapter. And it's the idea that above actuality, always stands possibility. In fact, I think that's a quote by Heidegger, but it's the same idea. It's an essential truth. Why? Because consciousness allows for all of these possibilities. Actuality is not so important. Really, if we want to understand the limits of consciousness, we have to understand the limits of possibilities. And so phenomenology then, because of this phenomenological reduction, in many ways you can think of as a cognition of possibilities, or at least a cognition of the structures that precede possibility and, of course, actuality itself. So those are a couple points I gained and I gleaned and I wanted to talk about from this section. But I will just be frank with you. There's a lot more in this passage that I'm skipping over. I encourage you to take a look at it. But it is a sort of excursion that isn't necessarily in depth into our topic at this point. Now, in section 80, we see Husserl engage in a discussion between the relationship of mental processes and the pure ego. And I've sort of tried to diagram it here, where we have a pure ego, but importantly, the pure ego is in itself empty, right, of these essence components, right? Because the pure ego is the thing that emanates, if you will, what we might call moments of thought, moments of cognition, or as he refers to it, these cogito, or the actional cogitations, right? And so all these arrows are meant to sort of signify the ways in which the pure ego has these actional cogitations, these active thoughts, if you will. But the ego itself is empty, right? It's empty of the content here, because it is that's what we mean by talking about the purity of the ego, as it were. Now, aside from the modes of comportment or relations, right, the ego is completely empty of these essence components. Now, when we discuss the mental processes of the ego, there's really two sides of the domain, right? So whenever we talk about the ego, that means that the pure ego has these emanating cogitations. And there's two ways in which we can talk about the domain of the ego. One is to talk about it in terms of its subjectivity, right? Or to talk about the ego as subjectively oriented. And by contrast, we can talk about objectivity or objectively oriented. Now, this will become very important because ultimately this signifies an essential division of the investigation itself. And we're going to see Husserl, especially in the next video when he talks about noesis and noema, that this ultimately is related to this division. And so Husserl, one of the things you may find as you're reading Husserl here is that Husserl will oftentimes talk about things and then he'll move on and you sort of lose track of what he's doing. But he's sort of, if you will, sedimenting for us or building slowly a sort of organization of our concepts. That's the systematicity, if you will. In section 81, we see a discussion of phenomenological time and consciousness of time, right? So let's talk about time for a minute. Time in consciousness. So think about the idea of when you're conscious of time. Now, there's two ways in which we can break this down. On the one hand, we can talk about phenomenological time. And phenomenological time refers to an effect of the phenomenological reduction, right? So phenomenological time is thinking about what time means in consciousness once we've bracketed out the actuality of our experiences and enacted the primary phenomenological reduction, the epoch, as well as other potential reductions. Now, this is different from what we call cosmic time. And in the Husserl's own notes, I don't know if he liked the term cosmic time. He also talks about time-space, right? So you can think of cosmic time here as being time-space, temporal dimension that physics studies, right? Of course, cosmic time is related to the immanental spread of phenomenal experience. Why? Because my phenomenal experience, of course, can only uh, what I experience in the immanent, right, is bounded as a condition of possibility by the physics of space-time. But once we bracket out the actuality, we're really just talking about phenomenological time, right? Time, he says, is the name of a delimited sphere of problems. Now, notice here, since we've bracketed out actuality in the phenomenological reduction, phenomenological time doesn't refer to time as an object somewhere, right? It's not. It really refers to a sphere of problems and a sphere of concepts um, for consciousness, for thinking about how consciousness operates. Let me see here, move to the next one. Husserl gives us a quote on 163. He says, quote, "The essential property which the term temporality expresses for any mental process whatever not only designates something universally belonging to every single mental process, but also a necessary form combining mental processes with mental processes." Now, this is important. So, not only is temporality, an essential factor in terms of thinking about all of these mental processes, but the time also refers to the way in which we combine mental processes with other mental processes. And here, of course, you can see that Husserl is pulling on this discussion of reflection. Because when I reflect and I recall something, I recollect, and then I think about those things, then we're talking about um, a temporal dimension of consciousness that is not immediately given when we normally think about time. By the way, I have blinds, and so you see all these white lines on my face. I apologize, but anyway, it is what it is. It's not your screen. Okay, now here's the one thing we should mention is, and he's mentioned this before when he talked about the flow or the stream of consciousness. There's only one stream of mental processes, right? There's only in consciousness for us, and remember, intentionality is about the directionality of that one stream of process over time. Now, the duration of mental processes is a reference to a fulfilled continuum, right? So I have a let's say for instance I take a walk down the park, and as I'm taking the walk, I start to reflect upon phenomenological philosophy, and I start to think about some of the issues that Husserl is talking about. Now, what's happening there is that in all of these mental processes, they're fulfilled. That is, there's a fulfilled intuitional content, right? But this all occurs within one streaming continuum. Um, for instance, here I have a sort of picture. Now, Husserl talks about this later on, but I've sort of jumped ahead here. And this is a sort of diagram to show you a sense of what Husserl has in mind when he talks about this single continuum. You can see is that each one of these points signifies a different point in time. Here's the future and here's the past. So we have point A, point B, and point C. And you can see that there's these sorts of diagonals. Now, what is Husserl's idea is that as consciousness is happening, right, we're going through the streaming of the living present, right? And at point A, right, I have a certain, right, this signifies the now at point A, when that's happening, when point A is actually happening, right? But that over time, it's not as if A is lost, but over time A recedes into the background, right? He signifies it here by a diagonal. And that means it's still given to me in retention, right? So at point B, I can still recognize point A, as it were, right? At point C, I can recognize the point A and point B. So, but you can see that as time goes through, right, my retention recedes further and further away from me. And this, of course, is a good description of what it's like to experience time in consciousness, right? As I'm walking down the park and I start to think about what Husserl talked about in chapter 1 and then chapter 2, chapter 3, right? I can remember the things that have immediately happened, but the further in the past those things are, the more obscure they become, right? And it's also important that even at point A, I can also, as it were, recognize or anticipate point B in the future as well, right? So you might say that at point A, for instance, here, when A is really happening, I can have a protension or an anticipation of a point B, or for instance, a point C or whatnot. So this sort of, you can see he's trying to describe the way in which time appears for us in consciousness, right? Time does not appear as a series of now points, right? We frequently talk about the past, the present, and the future when we talk about time, but we all know that that's not what time is like for us in consciousness. Time is rather this stream of movement, where things are coming and going, and we can see, anticipate things in the future, and not anticipate things. And so that's also very important. Another example here, Husserl doesn't mention it, but it's sort of maybe significant to think about descriptively, is to think about, for instance, how, for instance, if you drive on a, for those of you that drive, if you drive on a road for the first time, you're going somewhere you've never gone before, it will often seem like it takes a long time to get there. As opposed to when you drive on a road you've been on a million times, right? And that trip can be very, very quick. Well, what's the difference? Well, the difference is when you go to a place you've never been before, right? You have an even more limited horizon of anticipation, right? There's less protension available to you, and therefore you're more attentive to the stream of time as it's given in a series of sort of now moments, you might say. So that's sort of interesting to think about here, right? The time that we experience in consciousness is not clock time, right? We're not experiencing time the way the movement of a clock signifies it. We're experiencing time according to the correlates of consciousness that are available to us, given, if you will, a horizon of the future and a horizon of the past. And he'll mention this here in just a moment as well. Here's a quick passage worth taking a look at. The actually present now is necessarily and remains something punctual, a persisting form of ever new material, right? And think here about how the given moment at any one moment sort of punctuates your experience, right? Where all this new material constantly flows in, as it were. It is likewise with the continuity of the just now. It's a continuity of forms of always new contents, a phase or an impression as the limit phase of a continuity of retentions, which, however, are not on an equal footing. They're instead to be related to one another continuously attentively, a continuous complexity of retentions of retentions, right? So we're sort of constantly having more and more retentions as we go through. Let's take a look at the next passage here. Now, this is when we're talking about the continuation and, and we're talking about the now moment. I don't know why I zoomed in there, right? Whenever we talk about the now, right, the now always has a horizon of the before, and that's not empty, right? So think about, you're sitting here right now watching this video. You have a horizon of what came before you started the video. And you also have a horizon of what will come after. And neither of those horizons are totally empty, right? But you have intuitional expectations, right? You sort of know that after this video, you're going to go get a drink of water or something. And you know that before this video, you had to log into the computer and all this other sort of stuff, right? So that means that the now moment, you can see I'm trying to describe the now moment here along with this sort of streaming of the living present, right? And what we have here is not just succession, but simultaneity. That is the idea that not only are these experiences happening in succession, but they're also somehow simultaneous in consciousness. That's what we talk about in terms of retention, right? I don't know where it is anymore, right? Let's go back here. Right, and so if you go back to this video here, or not this video, but this picture I have here, you can see here that his diagram represents, through these diagonal lateral lines, it signifies the simultaneity of time consciousness. Now, ultimately, this is important when we talk about reflection, because that's how reflection works, right? Reflection pulls a previous retention, and then you work with that retention, and so somehow, the time consciousness of reflection is one in which not only are we thinking about something, but we're simultaneously thinking of it at the same time. There's simultaneity. Now, one pure ego, one stream of mental processes fulfilled with respect to all three dimensions, the three dimensions of the now, the horizon of the before, and the horizon of the after, these are essentially concatenated in this fulfilling, summoning itself in its continuity of content. And these are all necessary correlates to each other. You can't have a now moment if you don't have a horizon of before or after. right? Now, in section 83, Husserl turns his attention to this notion of the seizing upon the unitary stream of mental processes, right, and as an idea. Now, let's let's start here. Now, the ego reaches a mental process by reflecting, right? So we can take a mental process in phenomenology, we reflect upon it, and that's how we reach it, right? And that means, in this reflection is a concatenation, right? Where I'm bringing different forms of something together in multiple perspectives, right? And synthesize them over time, if you will. No, reflection is never a single pure regarding of something, right? So reflection is not just re-experiencing something at all, right? It's a concatenation of a mental process. Now, when we talk about mental processes, there's, if you will, Husserl calls a horizon of mental processes. And on the one hand, every mental process here has its phenomenological time. We've sort of mentioned that in terms of simultaneity and so forth. But every mental process also has a novel mode of givenness. That's what makes the mental process that you analyze different from another mental process, right? So, for instance, if the phenomenologist is thinking about the difference between the experience of something that's given in the intuitionally present, like here's my watch and it's right before you in immanent consciousness, and then I'm also comparing what it means to think about the idea of a watch, right? You can see here is that there's a phenomenological time to both of these, but there's also a novel mode of givenness for each. And that's very important when we talk about the evaluation of mental processes. Now, it also is important to recognize that no concrete mental process can be accepted as a self-sufficient one in the full sense. Why? Because of concatenation, right? Everything is a concatenation because of the directionality of consciousness. And so there's no concrete mental process that's just self-sufficient and singularly one in the full sense of the term. Every one of these is in need of a supplementation of some sort. And here you can start to see the simultaneity of reflection plays a large role in this regard. So, in 167, thus perception itself changes according to change in the determinedness of the surroundings, right? So, how things appear to us changes our evaluation of things. Now, or it changes, I guess, not the evaluation, but it changes. Section 84. In Section 84, Husserl signifies what really is the principal theme of phenomenology, the magnum opus of phenomenology, in the core of phenomenological science, and that is intentionality. Now, we talked about intentionality before, so I'm not going to completely re-go over all that, but we will say that for Husserl's perspective at this point in Ideas 1, is the intentionality of what characterizes consciousness in the pregnant sense, in which at the same time justifies designating the whole stream of mental processes at the stream of consciousness and as one unity of one consciousness. I just read that, and I don't think it's totally clear what he's up to there, just because I pulled it out of the text like this. But you can say here that consciousness is the principal theme, because intentionality, because intentionality is the means by which this stream of the living present is given to me as one single process, which means that intentionality is really the core thing that phenomenologists are actually studying. It's the one comprehensive name for an entire set of all-inclusive phenomenological structures, or structures for consciousness. Now, intentionality, of course, just means the consciousness of something, or the directionality of consciousness, such that in every actional cogito, right, every actional cogitation, a radiating regard is directed from the pure ego to the object, and that affects the very different kinds of consciousness of it, right? And what he's saying here is that when we talk about intentionality, we have to recognize that there's different forms of intentionality. For instance, when I'm at a comedy club and I'm directing myself towards the jokes, I direct myself in a comedic way, right? Or think of more specifically, he gives the example of willing, right? So when I will an object, I'm willing it in a certain way. My intentionality is characterized, the directionality of how I perceive something is characterized, or think if I like something or valuing something, right? If I value something, then I'm already directed at an object in a specific way. And also thinking here about the nearness and farness of intentionality in the phenomenological sense that we covered in our previous video. Now, this section here is a little bit difficult, I think. And it's the difference here is that what Husserl wants to say is, okay, when we talk about intentionality, we have to realize that there's a difference between the object of our sensations, the sensuous hele, right? That's the sort of term there, hele, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, and the intentive morphe, right? There's the morphe part there. And what he's saying is there's a difference between the sensuous object given to me. He calls this the hyletic data, right? There's a difference between the hyle and the morphe, right? The forms. You might say that sensuous data presents itself as stuffs. They're things for intentive formings, right? So for instance, like, let's say I'm really thirsty and I see the water bottle, right? I direct myself towards it as something to value, something that I want. Right? I don't just recognize it as a bottle, I recognize it as a bottle for me, right? And so that means that when we talk about intentionality, we have to get clear about what forms of directionality we have, right? So just seeing the object, the sensuous data, you think of it as a stuff that's there for my ability to form myself, my intentionality in a certain way, and that gives it certain forms of sense bestowings, right? And one of the ways we can understand this is, on the one hand, we can talk about stuffs that are formless, and we can talk about forms that are stuffless, right? And you can see what he's trying to bracket out here is really the difference between the object in consciousness given to me through perception and my approach and my intent, the form of my intentional directedness, right? He's trying to slowly demarcate these two things, and he does so eventually by introducing a really important term, and it'll be the term that's really at the heart of the next video, and that's the term of noesis. Noesis comes from the Greek term nous, and nous refers to mind. Aristotle used that to talk about the mind. Now, noesis is Husserl's way of differentiating the mental act process of intentionality, right? For instance, the willing and the valuing and all this sort of stuff. The stream of phenomenological being has, if you will, a stuff stratum and a noetic stratum, right? So on the one hand, I can talk about consciousness recognizes objects, and there we're talking about the stratum and the structure of stuff, the object, whatever that is in consciousness, and also the way in which I direct it, the noetic stratum. And this will become pretty important later. Now in 86 here, we get a discussion of what the core functional problems are. Functional problems concern the way in which these noeses, right, by animating stuff and combining it into a manifold of unitary continua and syntheses, bring about consciousness of something that the objective unity of the objectivity allows of being harmoniously made known, legitimated, and rationally determined. Here he's basically sort of saying that when we talk about functional problems, what we're talking about is, how is it possible, really, that all of these different demarcations in consciousness, right, if you will, the stuffs and the noeses, all of this gets harmonized into a single experience. And these are functional problems. Function is grounded in the essence of the noesis, right? Because intentionality is this principal theme that we're looking at. So this is the universal problem of phenomenology, and it's universal because it's a transcendental problem. And here he introduces, or he references the term, we've mentioned it before, transcendental phenomenology. That is, now when we assess and look at the functional problems of phenomenology at the highest level of the universal structures of consciousness, we're now engaged in a transcendental phenomenological analysis. That is, we want to understand what's necessarily the case such that all of our forms of consciousness take these ways of being. And that's the functional problems. Now, in the next video, we're going to be taking a look at noesis and noema, respectively. So, thank you guys very much for watching this video. I hope this video gave you some sense of what Husserl is engaged in his overall project of Ideas 1. So, thanks a lot for watching. I hope you found this video helpful, and I look forward to seeing you guys online.